The weekend started out like any other. A group of friends and I had booked a beach house for a couple of days, just to get away from the city noise and work stress. It was a small group, 5 of us in total, me, my 2 closest friends from college, and 2 others I'd known through work. We'd all been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The house was right on the beach, a beautiful, older-style home with big windows overlooking the ocean. The kind of place you imagine when you think of a relaxing weekend by the sea. When we arrived, it was early afternoon. The sun was bright and warm, the salty air filled with the sound of waves crashing gently on the shore. The house looked perfect from the outside, well kept but with that slightly worn charm that made it feel like a real home. We unloaded our bags, took in the view, and started planning our weekend. We figured we'd spend most of the time on the beach or cooking dinners together, maybe go out to a few local spots nearby. The inside of the house was just as nice as the photos. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a kitchen that was big enough for all of us to cook together. Everything was clean and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The furniture was simple but comfortable, soft couches, a big dining table, a few decorative touches like seashells and framed pictures of the beach. It was perfect. After settling in, we all decided to take a walk down to the beach. The sand was warm under our feet and the water cool when we waded in. We spent a few hours there, just talking, laughing, and watching the sunset. It felt like the kind of weekend that would be easy to forget, but also exactly what we needed. That first night, nothing felt off. We ate dinner, drank a little wine, played some music, and then started settling down. The bedrooms were upstairs with windows that looked out over the beach. I shared a room with one of my friends. We talked about how nice the place was before drifting off to sleep, the sound of the ocean like a steady background hum. The next morning, after breakfast, one of my friends, Jake, noticed something strange. He was fiddling with the smoke detector in the living room. It was blinking. Normally, those things just beep if the battery is low or it senses smoke, but this one was blinking a steady, slow light. It caught his eye because it was different than the usual flashing when batteries were dying. He pointed it out and we all gathered around. We looked closely. The blinking light was faint but consistent, almost like a small camera lens. It was tiny, barely noticeable unless you were right up next to it. Jake had a tech background, so he grabbed his phone and started trying to figure out if it could actually be a camera. It took a while, but eventually he managed to open up the smoke detector carefully, and inside, hidden where no one would expect, was a small camera device. It had a tiny lens and some wiring leading to what looked like a wireless transmitter. We froze. None of us could believe it. A hidden camera in the smoke detector in the living room? The first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe a weird security setup from the host? But it didn't feel right. None of US had agreed to any surveillance in the private areas of the house. We all knew that some rentals had cameras outside for security, but inside was a big no-no. That discovery set off a chain reaction. We started checking every room carefully. The bedrooms, the bathrooms, the kitchen, anywhere we could think of. In the second bedroom, Jake found another camera hidden in a small air vent near the ceiling. It was even smaller and trickier to spot, but it was definitely there. In the bathroom, there was nothing visible at first, but after looking closely, we noticed a tiny hole drilled into the wall above the shower. We took a flashlight and looked inside. There was another lens, hidden behind the hole, aimed right at where someone would stand in the shower. By then, our mood had shifted completely. We weren't on vacation anymore. We felt violated and scared. The thought that someone had been watching us in the most private moments was deeply unsettling. None of us slept that night. Instead, we sat up in the living room, pulling out our phones, taking pictures of the cameras and the suspicious spots in the house. The next morning, we contacted the local police. We told them everything, showed them the cameras, and the spots where we found them. The officers took the situation seriously. They came to the house, collected the cameras as evidence, and started an investigation. It turned out the host had installed several hidden cameras throughout the house, including in the bedrooms and bathrooms, without informing any guests. The police explained that this was illegal. Homeowners and Airbnb hosts are not allowed to record guests in private areas, and anyone caught doing so can face serious charges. We learned that there had been other complaints against this host from previous guests who had noticed strange things but hadn't found the cameras. We pressed charges, and the host was arrested a few days later. The investigation revealed that the cameras had been active for months, streaming footage directly to the host's phone. The thought of how many people had unknowingly been recorded in this supposedly safe place was disturbing. The whole experience left a mark on us. At first, we wanted to forget about it and move on, but we couldn't ignore the feeling of violation. We talked about how easy it was to be caught off guard, how important it was to trust your instincts and look out for signs when renting places, no matter how nice they seem online. After the police cleared everything, we stayed a little longer in town, renting a different place, one with no surprises. We spent the last days of our trip together on the beach, trying to relax and reclaim the peaceful feeling we had come for. In the end, we shared our story publicly to warn others. We wanted people to know that even places that seem perfect can hide dark secrets. We learned to be cautious, to inspect places carefully, and never to ignore strange signs. The experience was frightening, but it also brought us closer together. We supported each other through the fear and uncertainty, and we made sure that this host would no longer be able to hurt anyone else. We didn't let the fear win. Instead, we stood up for ourselves and took action, and that made all the difference. The city buzzed all day long, but by the time night came, the streets outside my Airbnb were quiet, almost too quiet. I was staying in a downtown apartment, a modern, small place on the third floor of an old brick building, the kind with creaky wooden stairs and a door that showed its age in chipped paint and rusty hinges. I had picked it because it was close to everything I wanted to see, and it looked nice in the photos. The host seemed friendly, and the place had good reviews, so I felt comfortable. I got in around 6 in the evening, tired from traveling. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows on the streets. I locked the front door behind me, tested it twice, and even checked the deadbolt. It was an old lock, but seemed to work fine. The apartment itself was cozy but plain. A small living room with a couch and a tiny kitchen with a stove and a fridge. The bedroom was in the back, separated by a short hallway. The windows faced a narrow alleyway between buildings. I figured I was safe. The building had a locked front entrance on the ground floor that you needed a code to open. I spent the evening unpacking, reading a little, and scrolling through my phone. The city's nightlife was lively just blocks away, but I decided to stay in early since I was drained from my trip. At around 10, I made some dinner and watched a show on my laptop. The walls were thin. I could hear faint sounds from the neighbors above and below, but nothing that bothered me. The creaks and groans of the building were familiar, almost comforting, like it was alive. I set my alarm for the next morning and prepared to go to bed early. I double-checked the door locks once more, locking the deadbolt firmly and pulling on the handle to be sure. Everything felt secure. I pulled the curtains shut, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. Midnight came quickly. I was half asleep when I heard it. A soft click, like the sound of a door opening downstairs. My heart jumped in my chest. The building was old, so it wasn't unusual to hear noises, but this sounded different, clear and deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy steps coming up the stairs. They echoed through the quiet building, growing louder as they climbed. The stairs in the building were narrow, wooden, and creaked with every step. I could almost hear the floorboards bending beneath weight. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were steady, and they seemed to stop just outside my door. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and quickly texted the host. I typed something simple. I heard the front door open and footsteps coming upstairs. I'm locked inside, but I'm really scared. Is someone else supposed to be here? Almost immediately, a reply came back. No, no one else should be there. You locked everything, right? Stay safe and call the police if you need. I felt a cold wave wash over me. No one else was supposed to be there, but the footsteps were definitely real. I wasn't imagining it. I sat on the bed, trying to steady my breathing. The apartment was dark except for the light from my phone screen. The door to the hallway was closed, but I didn't want to look outside. I dialed 911, whispering my situation as quietly as I could. The operator assured me they would send someone right away. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, waiting for the police to arrive. My ears were straining for any sound. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard the door handle jiggle. Someone was trying to open my apartment door. The deadbolt was holding, but they kept at it, tugging and pushing, making the door creak. My heart pounded so loud I thought the person might hear it. The police arrived quickly, sirens muffled outside. I unlocked the door and opened it for them. They swept through the apartment, checking every room and the hallway, but found no one. Outside, they examined the front door lock on the building and my apartment door. One of the officers pointed out that the lock on my apartment door had been tampered with. The latch was scratched and bent, like someone had tried to pick or force it. They assured me that nothing seemed broken enough to get in, but the attempt was clear. They took a report and said they would increase patrols in the area. I thanked them, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The officer told me to stay somewhere else if I didn't feel safe. I ended up booking a hotel room across town for the night. I packed my things quickly, feeling watched even as I left the apartment. The thought that someone had tried to get inside while I was there made my skin crawl. The next day, I checked the apartment again during daylight. The scratches on the lock were more visible, and I noticed the front door to the building had a faint scratch near the keypad. Someone had clearly been trying to get in, and it wasn't random. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I told the host what the police had said, and they apologized but didn't offer much explanation. I didn't return to the apartment. Instead, I cut my trip short. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. The building was old, and the locks were outdated, but they held. Whoever tried to get in that night was close, just outside my door. The thought that they might have gotten past the lock chills me even now. I still get nervous in quiet places, especially old buildings with creaky stairs. But that night taught me to trust my instincts and never ignore the small sounds that don't feel right. Locking doors is just the first step. Being ready to act when something feels off can save you. After that night, I changed the way I choose places to stay. I now check locks carefully, ask about security measures, and avoid old buildings with weak doors. It's scary to think how close I was to something worse, but I'm grateful that I was alert, that I called for help, and that no one got in. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the echo of footsteps in the silence. And I remember how real fear feels when you're alone and the lock you trusted suddenly feels fragile. That night stayed with me, a warning I haven't forgotten. I booked a single-room Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The listing looked perfect at first glance. It was in an older, somewhat charming house that seemed well kept from the outside, nestled between two similar homes on a tree-lined street. The pictures showed a clean, bright room with a large window letting in natural light, a simple bed with crisp sheets, a small desk, and a few shelves. The description promised a cozy, private room with access to a shared kitchen and bathroom. The price was fair, and I needed a place for just a couple of nights while I was working in the area. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the street. The house looked just as it did in the photos, maybe even better in person. I rang the bell, and the host, a middle-aged man with a polite but somewhat stiff smile, greeted me. He had a clipboard and a key in hand, ready to show me inside. As I stepped through the front door, I noticed the house smelled a bit strange, sort of old and musty, but nothing too overpowering at first. The main hallway was dimly lit, with wood paneling that looked aged and slightly scratched in places. I followed him past the living room, which was filled with mismatched furniture covered in dust covers, and the kitchen, which looked functional but not very welcoming. The floors creaked under my feet as we moved down the narrow corridor. Then he stopped and opened a door I hadn't expected. It was a tiny, dark room that wasn't shown in any of the photos or mentioned anywhere in the description. The door opened inward, revealing a space so small it was almost claustrophobic. The walls were a dull, faded brown, covered with dozens of strange scratches and marks, some deep enough to catch the light in a way that made them look like scars. The air in the room was thick and smelled strongly of dampness and mildew, like it hadn't been aired out in years. There was no window, none. The only light came from a dim overhead bulb that flickered slightly as it turned on. The floor was bare, cold, and uneven in places. There was a thin mattress laid out on the floor, stained and worn, with a pillow that looked flattened and dirty. No desk, no chair, no shelf, nothing else in the room. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. The room was nothing like the listing. It wasn't even close. It felt more like a storage closet someone had decided to convert into a sleeping space, just to squeeze in another guest. I looked back at the host, but he didn't say anything, just stood there silently, waiting for me to react. I shook my head and stepped back into the hallway. The feeling of being trapped in that tiny room made my skin crawl. The scratches on the walls looked fresh in some places, and there was a lingering damp smell that felt unhealthy. I couldn't imagine spending even one night there. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it felt unsafe. I told the host I wouldn't be staying there and demanded a refund. He looked annoyed but didn't argue much. I left immediately and found a nearby motel where I could book a room for the night. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that dark little room and how I had almost trusted the listing without questioning it. Later, I reported the experience to Airbnb. They investigated and found that the host had been listing the same house with different photos and misleading descriptions to hide the fact that some rooms were nothing like advertised. The dark, windowless room I saw was used to squeeze in extra guests without proper accommodations or safety measures. After several complaints from other guests, the host was banned from Airbnb permanently. The whole experience left me shaken, but it also reminded me how important it is to trust your instincts and check the details carefully when booking a place to stay. It's easy to get caught up in good photos and cheap prices, but sometimes what's behind the door is very different. The lesson stuck with me. Always ask questions, look for honest reviews, and never accept a place that makes you feel unsafe, even if it means losing money or scrambling for a last-minute room. My gut told me something was off, and I'm glad I listened. From then on, I made sure to book places with clear, transparent listings and hosts who communicated openly. I've never encountered anything like that again, but every time I travel now, I remember the cold, musty room with no windows and the eerie scratches on the walls. Proof that sometimes the worst nightmare isn't a ghost story, but real life. I was on a tight budget when I booked my Airbnb for the weekend. The city was huge, expensive, and almost everything close to downtown was way out of my price range. After hours of scrolling and searching, I finally found a place that was cheap enough. A basement apartment in a pretty old building, right in the middle of the city. The pictures showed a small but clean room, and the host had decent reviews, nothing glowing but nothing bad either. It was perfect for what I needed, just a place to crash after work events and sightseeing. When I arrived, the building itself looked a bit run down. The brick outside was chipped and grimy, and the front door had a rusty old lock. I called the host from the street, and he told me to use the side entrance and gave me a code for the keypad. The side door was narrow, barely lit by a flickering bulb, and the steps leading down were steep and made of concrete. It felt like I was entering some forgotten part of the city. The moment I stepped inside the basement, I was hit by a cold, damp smell. The air was heavy and stale, and it was much colder than the outside. The only light came from my phone's flashlight. There was no window down here, just thick stone walls that swallowed the light and made everything feel deeper in the dark. I flicked the switch for the main light, nothing happened. I tried the second switch, still nothing. The place was pitch black except for the thin beam from my phone. I pulled out my jacket and tried to shake off the chill, then started to explore the small basement. The walls were rough, made of old bricks and mortar, and I noticed the floor wasn't smooth but cracked and uneven. What really caught my attention were the chains and old, rusty locks hanging from several hooks on the walls. Some chains were thick and heavy, others looked thinner but still strong. The locks looked like they hadn't been used in decades, but the metal was still solid. At first, I thought they were just decorations or maybe left behind by some previous tenant. I even tried to take a closer look, running my fingers over the cold metal. Later, I asked the host about them through a message. His reply was short, almost dismissive. He said something like, "Old stuff from the building's past. Nothing to worry about." That vague answer didn't really satisfy me, but I didn't press further. I figured old buildings sometimes had weird relics hanging around. That night, I barely slept. The cold kept me awake more than anything else. The basement didn't have much insulation, and the little heater they left wasn't strong enough to warm the entire space. Every sound was amplified in the silence. The hum of the city outside, the occasional creak from the floorboards above. I kept thinking about those chains and locks, how out of place they seemed for a basement apartment. The next morning, I decided to step outside and maybe explore the neighborhood a bit. I was standing by the front door when I ran into an elderly man on the sidewalk. We started talking casually, and I asked him about the building. He paused and gave me a strange look before telling me something I wasn't expecting. He said the basement had a history, a long, dark one. Back during Prohibition, the basement was used by local law enforcement and bootleggers alike. It wasn't an official jail, but a makeshift holding cell where criminals were kept temporarily before being moved or released. The chains and locks I saw were probably used back then to keep prisoners restrained. The basement was notorious in the neighborhood, a place where many people had been locked up, sometimes for days. He explained how the basement wasn't just a storage space or an apartment. It was a reminder of a rough time in the city's history. The walls had witnessed fights, fear, and people waiting for their fate behind those cold bricks. The old man said the building had been renovated several times, but they never removed those chains and locks, maybe as a warning or simply because they were too much trouble to take down. Hearing that, everything about the basement suddenly made sense. The cold, the darkness, the old chains. It wasn't just an odd choice for a rental. It was a place with a past that still lingered in its very structure. I couldn't shake off the feeling that the building itself carried the weight of all those tense, desperate moments from nearly 100 years ago. I went back down to the basement and took another look. The silence was heavier than before, and the walls seemed even colder somehow. The chains clinked softly when I brushed against them, and I imagined how those sounds might have echoed back when the basement was a holding cell. The thought made me uncomfortable. This wasn't a place meant to be lived in, not really. It was meant for punishment and confinement. Without hesitation, I packed my things and left the apartment that day. I didn't tell the host why. I just messaged him that I was leaving early and needed a refund. He didn't argue. I spent the rest of the weekend at a cheap motel outside the city center. It was more expensive, but the warmth and natural light made it worth every penny. I learned that sometimes the cheapest option comes with more than just a low price. It carries history and atmosphere that you might not be ready to face. Looking back, I realize I barely scratched the surface of that basement story. I didn't want to know more, honestly. The idea of sleeping in a place that once held people against their will, in cold chains on rough floors, was enough to make me move on. I didn't feel safe, not emotionally or mentally, even though there was nothing supernatural there. The real fear came from knowing what had happened there, from understanding the heavy past that still seemed to fill the air. I've stayed in plenty of basements, cheap rooms, and old apartments since then, but nothing ever made me want to leave as quickly as that basement in the city. It's strange how history can reach out and affect you, even decades later, in a place you thought was just another cheap place to stay. The chains on the walls weren't just metal, they were a reminder of a darker time, and that reminder was too much for me. I booked the cottage on a quiet stretch of countryside that promised a break from city noise. The listing called it a family-friendly cozy retreat, perfect for a weekend getaway. The pictures showed a charming little house with whitewashed walls, a porch with a swing, and flower beds bursting with color. I was tired of the usual hotels and wanted something peaceful, somewhere I could just relax, maybe catch up on reading, and take long walks. The price was reasonable, and the host seemed nice enough in the messages. I figured it was just what I needed. When I arrived, the place was exactly as advertised, quaint and tidy, with the smell of fresh paint mixed with old wood. The garden was neat, and a few birds chirped nearby. I parked my car beside the cottage and stepped inside. The floors creaked gently underfoot, and the sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls. It felt warm and inviting, like a place someone had lovingly cared for. But as soon as I stepped in, my eyes caught sight of a doll sitting in the corner of the living room. It was old-fashioned, one of those porcelain-faced dolls with painted eyes and curled hair tied with faded ribbons. It wore a lace dress, yellowed with age, and its face was fixed in a faint, neutral smile. At first, I thought it was just a decorative piece, the kind of thing someone might leave behind to add charm or maybe a little nostalgia to the room. I didn't pay it much mind and moved on to explore the rest of the cottage. The kitchen was small but well-equipped, with a kettle, a toaster, and a few mismatched dishes stacked neatly in the cabinets. The bedroom had a soft, old quilt on the bed, and the windows opened wide to let in the fresh air. I unpacked my bag and settled in, feeling pleased with the cozy atmosphere. That first night, after a long drive, I was ready to sleep early. I turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and crawled under the quilt. But as I lay there in the dark, I started hearing sounds that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, like tiny footsteps, almost like someone was walking softly across the floorboards. Then, there was a quiet giggling, just out of reach. It wasn't loud enough to be real, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. I sat up and listened closely, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I flicked on the bedside lamp and looked around. Nothing moved, and the room was empty except for me. I shrugged and told myself it was probably the house settling or the wind outside. Old houses make noises at night. I tried to go back to sleep, but the giggling started again, just as soft as before, and the footsteps seemed closer this time, like they were pacing near the living room. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired from the trip. I got up early and made some coffee, sitting at the kitchen table and looking around. That doll was still there in the same spot as before. But when I glanced away for a moment and looked back, it had moved. It wasn't sitting in the corner anymore. It was now on the low shelf by the fireplace. I blinked hard and looked again. Maybe I was seeing things, I thought. I moved over and put the doll back in the corner, shaking my head. I spent the day walking around the small village nearby, talking to a few locals and enjoying the quiet. The cottage felt safe in the daylight, but when I returned, the doll had moved again. This time it was sitting upright on the armrest of the couch, staring right at me. My skin prickled. I moved it back and made sure to put it out of sight behind a stack of books. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps were louder and more frequent, circling the room. The giggling was sharper, and sometimes it felt like there were whispers just beyond hearing. Couldn't sleep. I kept checking the doll's spot every few minutes. Each time it had moved somewhere new, on the windowsill, near the kitchen table, even once on the bathroom sink. I stopped trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. It was too consistent to be coincidence. The doll was moving on its own. I locked the doors and windows, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to stay calm. I told myself no one was here with me, no one had entered the house, and the doll wasn't alive. Still, the sound of those footsteps and the giggling kept me on edge until dawn. The next day, I messaged the host through the app. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept it simple. Is there any history to the doll in the living room? I've noticed it moves, and I've been hearing noises at night. The reply came much later, just a short message. The host said the doll belonged to a child who had lived in the house years ago. The child's family moved away suddenly, and locals said the doll was haunted or cursed. The host himself didn't believe it, but he thought it was best to let guests know, just in case. I didn't respond. The word haunted sent a chill through me. I wasn't a superstitious person, but I also didn't want to stay and find out more. I packed my things quickly, trying to ignore the unease twisting in my stomach. Before leaving, I took one last look around the living room. The doll was back in its original corner, sitting perfectly still, but I wasn't fooled. I felt like it had been watching me the whole time. I didn't wait to say goodbye to the host or ask questions. I locked the door behind me, jumped in my car, and drove away as fast as I could, the uneasy feeling growing heavier with every mile. After I got home, I tried to shake off the experience. I told a few friends about it, expecting them to laugh or dismiss it. Some thought it was funny, others said old houses had creaky noises, and the doll moving was probably just me misplacing it. But I knew what I had seen and heard. The doll wasn't just decoration, and the noises weren't just the house settling. A few weeks later, I checked the reviews online for that cottage. Several guests mentioned the doll and strange noises. Some laughed it off. Others said they left early, just like me. The host had posted a short note warning people about the doll, but said it was part of the house's charm. I never went back, and I never stayed in a place with an old doll sitting alone in the corner again. It wasn't about ghosts or spooky stories. It was about feeling watched, unsettled, and unsafe in a place that was supposed to be peaceful. The cottage was cozy, all right, but that doll, and the sounds at night, made it something else entirely, something I wasn't willing to face twice. The weekend was supposed to be a break from everything. Just me and my girlfriend, Sarah, tucked away in a small cabin in the woods. We found the place online, an Airbnb listing that looked perfect. It was far from town, with no neighbors in sight. The pictures showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, a porch with a few rocking chairs, and a fireplace inside. The listing promised peace and quiet, and that's exactly what we wanted after months of non-stop work and city noise. We packed up Friday morning, leaving early to avoid traffic. The drive was long but calming, the road winding through dense forests and hills. When we pulled up, the cabin looked even better in person. It stood alone on a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We unloaded the car slowly, taking in the fresh air and the quiet that seemed to wrap around the place like a blanket. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small living area with a couch and a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with the basics, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed. The windows all had thick curtains, and there were heavy wooden doors that locked firmly. The owner had left a note welcoming us and giving instructions on how to use the security cameras outside and inside the cabin. The cameras weren't obvious at first glance. Small black boxes hidden near the ceiling in the living room and by the front door. That first night was perfect. We made a fire in the stove, cooked some dinner, and then sat on the porch for a while, watching the stars come out. No other lights anywhere. No sounds except the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, exactly what we needed. The next day, we explored the nearby trails and found a small creek a few minutes from the cabin. We took our time, enjoying the quiet, the sound of water running over rocks, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles. We came back tired and happy, planning to spend the evening watching movies and maybe having another fire. That night is when things started to feel off. We went to bed early, both exhausted from the hike. The cabin felt cold, but the heater was working fine. Around midnight, I was almost asleep when I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Sarah shifting in bed or maybe an animal outside. But the footsteps were slow and deliberate, walking softly across the wooden floor. They stopped near the bedroom door. I froze. The door was locked, and I checked it without opening. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside with us. Sarah didn't wake up. I didn't want to disturb her and thought maybe I imagined it. After a few minutes, the sound started again, quieter this time, like someone was moving carefully around the living room. My heart was pounding, but I didn't know what to do. I wanted to check the cameras, but it was the middle of the night, and the cabin had no Wi-Fi except for a weak cell signal outside. We couldn't see the footage from our phones. I lay awake the rest of the night, barely sleeping, listening for any noise. The footsteps never came near the bedroom again, but I kept hearing soft movements, like someone shifting or breathing in the next room. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling or animals outside, but I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I called the owner. I explained what happened, trying not to sound too panicked. He seemed calm but said the cabin was in a remote area, and sometimes animals or even deer caused noises. He said the doors and windows were all secure and locked, and no one could have gotten in. Still, I wasn't convinced. We spent the day outside, but I kept thinking about those footsteps. When we got back that evening, I decided to check the security cameras myself. The owner had left the password on a note, so I connected the tablet to the cabin's Wi-Fi and opened the app. The footage was chilling. Around 3 p.m., when we were out hiking, a man appeared at the front door. He looked around nervously, then used a slim tool to pick the lock. The door clicked open, and he slipped inside quickly, shutting the door softly behind him. The cameras showed him walking slowly through the cabin. He opened drawers and looked around, but didn't take anything. Instead, he moved toward a closet near the bedroom. The man opened the closet door, disappeared inside, and closed it behind him. The footage jumped to later that night, around midnight, the exact time I heard the footsteps. The man quietly stepped out of the closet and moved around the cabin, staying just out of the bedroom. He seemed cautious, almost scared himself. After a few minutes, he returned to the closet and stayed there until dawn. I replayed the video several times, feeling a mix of fear and anger. We had been sleeping with an intruder hiding just a few feet away. I called the owner back immediately, demanding to know why he hadn't told us about this. His tone changed. After a long pause, he admitted that the cabin had been broken into before, months earlier. Someone had gotten in the same way, but nothing was stolen, and no one was hurt. He apologized for not telling us, saying he didn't want to scare guests away or ruin their experience. I told him we were leaving immediately. We packed up our things in silence, the air heavy with tension. As we locked the cabin for the last time, I double-checked every door and window. On the drive back, neither of us said much. The woods that had seemed so peaceful now felt like a trap. When we got home, I reported the break-in to the local police and the AIRBNB platform. They told me they would investigate, but these kinds of things in remote areas were hard to prevent. Looking back, the worst part wasn't the break-in itself. It was knowing someone had been inside the same space as us, hidden and watching while we thought we were safe. The owner's silence felt like a betrayal. We trusted that place to give us peace, but it almost cost us everything. Since then, I've been more careful about where I stay. I check reviews for any hint of trouble, ask questions about security, and never ignore my gut feeling. The woods might be quiet, but sometimes the danger is closer than you think, hiding just behind a locked door. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway to clear my head, a break from the noise of work and the endless demands of daily life. I found the Airbnb through a last-minute deal online. The place looked perfect in the pictures. An old but charming house set back in the woods, far enough from the town to promise peace and quiet. The host's profile was solid, with good reviews. No red flags. I didn't think twice about booking it. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The GPS led me down narrow country roads, surrounded by dense forest. The trees leaned over the road like they were watching, branches scraping the sides of my car. When I finally reached the driveway, the house was just as the pictures showed. Wooden siding, paint peeling in places, but still solid looking. It sat on a small hill with a gravel driveway, the kind of place you expect to see in a mystery novel. The sun was setting behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the porch. I parked and took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. I told myself it was just the quiet and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I grabbed my bags and walked up to the front door. The lock clicked open smoothly. The host had sent me a keypad code in advance. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, damp wood mixed with an earthy, almost musty scent. It wasn't unpleasant, just the smell of an old house that hadn't been lived in for a while. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I moved through the entryway. The house was small, maybe 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The furniture was sparse but clean, with a worn leather couch and a small dining table with mismatched chairs. A few books and magazines sat on a shelf, but nothing too personal. I liked the simplicity. I unpacked my things quickly and started exploring. The kitchen was basic but functional. There was a stove, a fridge, and a small counter. I found some canned goods and coffee packets left by the host, along with a note saying, "Welcome. Hope you enjoy your stay." It felt welcoming, but the silence in the house was heavy. I flicked on some lights. The bulbs were dim but worked. Outside, I could hear the forest settling for the night. Distant birds calling and the occasional rustle of small animals. No cars, no people, just the woods. I sat down on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky darken. The stars started to come out in clusters, bright and cold. Later, I made myself some dinner and ate at the table by the window. The kitchen light was the only thing on, and shadows from the tree branches moved across the walls like slow fingers. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the quiet and the dark messing with my senses. After dinner, I settled on the couch with a book. The wind had picked up outside, pushing branches against the windows with a sharp tapping noise. The house was creaking and settling, and every little sound made me jump. I tried to focus on the book, but the silence around me felt unnatural, almost like the house was holding its breath. When I finally decided to go to bed, I noticed the bedroom was colder than the rest of the house. The windows were old, and despite the curtains, I could see faint shapes moving outside in the shadows. I locked the door, pulled the blanket tight, and tried to sleep, but the house didn't let me rest. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. It was faint at first, a soft scraping like something being dragged across wood. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I reminded myself there was no one else here. It was an old house, maybe a branch hitting the window or the floorboards shifting. I got up slowly and opened the door just a crack. The hallway was empty and dark. I couldn't see anything, but the scraping sound had stopped. I scanned the floor with my flashlight, checking for anything out of place. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it again, telling myself to calm down. I sat on the bed for a while, but then another noise came, this time from downstairs. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and slow, moving across the wooden floor. I swallowed hard, trying not to panic. I told myself the host might have come in to check something and forgotten to leave a note. But it was almost 1 a.m. Who would do that? I grabbed my phone and checked the Airbnb messages. Nothing new. I considered calling the host but hesitated. Maybe it was just an animal getting inside the house somehow. But how would it get upstairs? I decided to investigate. I crept out of the bedroom, flashlight in hand, and carefully went down the stairs. Each step groaned loudly, echoing through the silent house. The hallway at the bottom was dark and still. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was slightly ajar. I felt a cold rush of fear. I had locked that door when I arrived. I stepped closer and pushed it shut. It wasn't locked. I found the bolt and slid it into place. No sign of forced entry or anything out of place inside the house. The windows were closed tight. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing hard, listening for any more noises. There was nothing but the wind outside and the distant calls of animals. I told myself to call the police if anything else happened. I wasn't going to stay in a place where someone might have broken in. I went back upstairs and checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains. The house felt different in the light, less threatening. I brewed some coffee and decided to leave early. I packed quickly, feeling eager to get back to civilization. As I was loading my bags into the car, I noticed something strange on the porch steps. A small pile of dry leaves and dirt, like someone had been dragging something there. I brushed it away, but underneath was a shallow scratch mark on the wood. It looked like something had been scraping the porch. I checked my phone again and found a new message from the host, sent early that morning. "Sorry for any noises last night. The house is old, and the woods around here are full of deer and raccoons. They sometimes come close and make noise. Hope you're having a good stay. I didn't reply. I got into my car and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the house fading behind me. I didn't feel scared anymore, just glad to be leaving. Later, when I got home and looked back over the pictures I had taken, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint set of footprints leading from the porch into the woods, too small to be an adult's, and the scratch marks on the porch were deeper than I thought. Maybe it was an animal, maybe not, but whatever it was, I knew I wouldn't go back there again. I learned something important that weekend. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the real, quiet moments where you realize how alone you really are and how little you can control in a place you thought was safe. The woods don't care about you. The old houses don't care either. They just exist, holding their secrets, waiting for someone to notice. And that's enough to unsettle anyone.